Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm really glad you're joining us today because we are tackling a highly requested, fiercely debated question that honestly directly impacts you or someone you know.
Yeah, it's a huge one. And it's so misunderstood, too.
Completely. I mean, usually when you think about your body healing, you picture something like structural and visible, like architecture, right? A
Yeah.
cut on your knee knitting back together, or a bruise fading.
Right, something you can actually watch heal in real time.
Exactly. But when we stepped into the world of vaginal health, we are dealing with an entirely invisible ecosystem. It's much closer to a coral reef or a rainforest than a simple structural repair. It's an
Yeah.
incredibly complex microscopic metropolis.
It really is the ultimate invisible ecosystem.
Mm.
And, when that environment gets thrown out of balance, the biological effects are profound. They're systemic, even if they remain completely unseen to the naked eye.
And that invisible balance is basically the absolute center of our mission for this deep dive. We are exploring the rapidly growing landscape of vaginal rejuvenation treatments.
Specifically, we're talking about energy-based devices, like fractional CO2 lasers and radiofrequency therapies.
Right, and we've pulled together a massive stack of sources for you today. We're looking at recent clinical trial data published in MDPI and PubMed. We've got pre- and post-care clinical guidelines from centers like the Women's Health Clinic.
And we also have official safety communications from the FDA, which definitely throws a wrench into things later on.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge plot twist. But we are using all of this material to answer one very pressing question. Can these laser and radiofrequency treatments actually trigger vaginal infections like thrush or bacterial vaginosis, which we usually just call BV?
It is a phenomenal question because, it forces us to look at how modern medical interventions interact with our body's natural baseline environments. We are essentially dropping a high-tech energy device into a prehistoric bacterial ecosystem.
It sounds kind of crazy when you put it like that. So to figure out how they interact, we have to map out the battlefield first, right? We have to look at the vaginal microbiome itself.
Yeah, start there.
Because I think a lot of us are used to the golden rule of the gut microbiome, where diversity is the ultimate goal. Like, you want a massive array of different bacterial strains to digest food and regulate your immune system.
Right, but the vaginal microbiome plays by completely opposite rules. The rules are totally inverted.
Wait, really? So diversity is bad?
Exactly. A healthy vaginal ecosystem is a strictly low-diversity environment. It is fiercely dominated by good bacteria, specifically a genus called Lactobacilli.
Okay, I saw that name all over the sources.
Yeah, in the clinical literature we're analyzing today, you'll constantly see specific strains highlighted, primarily Lactobacillus crispatus and Lactobacillus in arcaners.
Right.
These strains are basically the fundamental architects of vaginal health.
And they aren't just like passively occupying space, are they? I read they are essentially tiny metabolic factories working around the clock.
They absolutely are. So the lactobacilli feed on glycogen, which is a complex sugar that's naturally stored in the healthy squamous epithelium of the vaginal wall.
The tissue wall, right?
Yep. And as a byproduct of metabolizing that glycogen, they continuously pump out lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide.
Wow. And that chemical production is their defense mechanism, right?
That's the ultimate defense mechanism. The lactic acid keeps the vaginal pH highly acidic, typically hovering between like 3.8 and 4.5.
That is intensely acidic.
It is. And that acidity provides what immunologists call colonization resistance. It basically creates an environment so harsh that invading pathogens simply cannot survive, let alone multiply.
I found myself picturing this entire ecosystem like a highly exclusive underground nightclub.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like the lactobacilli are the heavily armed bouncers standing at the door,
Yeah.
and they are enforcing this brutally strict dress code, which is that low pH. If an invading bacteria can't handle the acid, they just don't get past the velvet rope.
That's exactly how it works. But, the problem arises when the bouncers abandon their posts.
Which happens in BV, right?
Exactly. That is the fundamental mechanism behind bacterial vaginosis. For various reasons, the lactobacilli populations deplete.
And when they deplete, the lactic acid production just halts.
Right. Which allows the pH to rise and become more alkaline. The door is suddenly left wide open for anaerobic troublemakers like Gardnerella vaginalis or Edipobium vaginae to rush in, overgrow, and trigger the hallmark symptoms of BV.
Like the altered discharge, the distinctive odor, and the localized inflammation.
Exactly.
And the triggers for that disruption are incredibly varied, too. I mean, the sources mentioned something as mechanical as douching can physically wash the bouncers away.
Yeah, douching is a big one.
Yeah.
Also, unprotected sex introduces alkaline seminal fluids that momentarily spike the pH.
Oh, interesting. So it temporarily alters the environment.
Right. Or, taking a broader physiological view, the hormonal shifts associated with menopause play a massive role.
Because of the estrogen dropping.
Exactly. When estrogen levels drop, the vaginal tissue thins out, glycogen production plummets, and the lactobacilli literally starve to death because their food source completely disappears.
Wow. Okay, so keeping that incredibly delicate, low-diversity ecosystem in mind, this brings us to the core of the clinical anxiety.
Lasers.
Right. If the microbiome is that sensitive to slight pH shifts or mechanical disruption, it seems completely counterintuitive to introduce a 360-degree fractional CO2 laser into the vaginal canal.
Yeah, you're delivering controlled thermal energy to vaporize columns of tissue.
Exactly. The logical assumption is that creating micro-injuries in an already delicate environment would act as a literal wrecking ball, just inviting massive infections.
That's what a lot of people think.
That was totally the assumption I had before opening the source stack. But the clinical reality check in the documentation completely flips the narrative.
And it really does.
Yeah, when you look at the strict pre- and post-care guidelines for devices like the Alma CO2 laser, getting a brand new infection from the laser procedure itself is officially classified as very rare.
Very rare.
Yeah.
And the rarity really comes down to the biophysics of how fractional lasers operate, combined with standard clinical sterility.
What do you mean by fractional?
So the term fractional means the laser beam is divided into thousands of microscopic columns. It creates tiny ablative zones, but leaves the surrounding tissue completely intact.
Okay, so it's not just burning the entire surface.
Exactly. Because the thermal damage is fractional and the equipment is heavily sterilized, the micro wounds heal incredibly fast, usually within a few days.
Meaning there is a very narrow window for external pathogens to actually take hold, assuming you're following basic post-care hygiene, of course.
Right. The real restriction in the clinical FAQs isn't about the laser causing a new infection out of nowhere.
It's about timing. The documentation explicitly states that if you have an active infection, whether that's active BV, active thrush, or even just undiagnosed urinary symptoms, the laser treatment has to be paused immediately.
There is a critical biological rationale for that hard stop, too. Inflamed, infected tissue has an incredibly compromised healing response.
Like it's already overwhelmed.
Exactly. If your vaginal mucosa is actively battling a Gardnerella overgrowth, it is swollen, the local immune cells are working overtime, and the cellular environment is heavily stressed out.
So applying thermal microtrauma to tissue in that state, it wouldn't stimulate rejuvenation.
No, it would overwhelm the local immune response and can actually exacerbate the inflammation.
It's the equivalent of trying to structurally remodel your kitchen while the drywall is actively on fire.
Ah, yes. You have to put the flames out first before you start knocking down walls.
Right. And beyond the compromised healing, the sources talked about diagnostic clarity.
Oh, that's a huge factor. Active BV causes distinct discharge, odor, and redness.
And when a clinician performs a fractional laser treatment, the patient naturally experiences a few days of mild swelling and a watery discharge, right? As the tissue expels those ablated cells.
Exactly. So if a patient is treated while actively infected, it becomes medically impossible for the clinician to differentiate the normal, expected healing response of the laser from a rapidly worsening bacterial infection. The clinical picture is completely blurred.
I have to admit, when I was reading through the clinical rationale for pausing the treatment, I found myself wanting to push back on the protocols.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, these energy-based devices are marketed as profound healing tools. They operate by delivering intense thermal heat. So why shouldn't a patient just use the laser to zap the bad bacteria away?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Right. Like if the tissue is infected, couldn't the heat essentially cook off the Gardnerella overgrowth instead of forcing the patient to wait for a long round of oral antibiotics to kick in?
It is a highly intuitive question, but it highlights a massive misconception that the medical literature takes great pains to correct.
Which is?
Energy-based devices are not antimicrobials. A fractional CO2 laser is entirely blind to microbiology.
So it doesn't distinguish between the good and the bad bugs?
Not at all. The thermal energy doesn't selectively target pathogenic Gardnerella while somehow preserving your beneficial lactobacilli.
The laser doesn't know who the bouncers are and who the troublemakers are. It just heats the tissue?
Exactly that. You cannot use an ablative device to bypass standard diagnostic testing and antimicrobial therapy. You must clear the active pathogen with traditional antibiotics or antifungals first.
You have to bring the biological fire under control.
Right, before you can focus on tissue remodeling.
So, synthesizing the direct answer to that core fear, the laser doesn't typically cause the infection, but it absolutely shouldn't be fired during one.
Correct.
But this is where the source material introduces a massive plot twist. Once that active infection is cleared by antibiotics, we have to look at the long-term impact of these laser treatments on the microbiome, because the clinical trial data demonstrates something remarkable.
The laser actually acts as a profound ecosystem restorer.
Yes, we shift entirely from viewing the laser as a localized risk to seeing it as a long-term preventative tool for dysbiosis.
The standout evidence in our stack is that 60-patient clinical trial highlighted across the PubMed and MDPI data.
I was blown away by this study. The researchers specifically targeted women suffering from vaginal relaxation syndrome, who also had a documented history of recurrent bacterial vaginitis.
Right. These are patients trapped in a relentless cycle. They get BV, they take a course of metronidazole, the infection clears temporarily, and then a month later, it just roars back.
It is a deeply frustrating, exhausting cycle that I know many listeners are all too familiar with. The standard medical protocol just keeps throwing antibiotics at the problem without addressing why the environment keeps failing.
Well, to test a new protocol, the researchers split these 60 women into two distinct groups. The control group received the standard, traditional care. So a course of oral antibiotics, specifically metronidazole, to eradicate the active BV.
And the intervention group?
They received the exact same course of metronidazole, but it was immediately followed by a scheduled regimen of fractional CO2 laser therapy.
The statistical divergence between these two groups is just wild.
It's massive.
In the control group that only took the antibiotics, their BV recurrence rate over the follow-up period was 36.67%.
So more than a third of them ended up right back where they started with another infection.
But in the intervention group, the women who had the antibiotics combined with the tissue remodeling of the laser, the recurrence rate plummeted to an astonishing 8.33%.
A drop from nearly 37% to 8% is a staggering statistical victory in the world of recurrent infections.
It really is. But how? To understand why this happens, we have to look at the cellular cascade triggered by those micro-injuries we discussed earlier.
Right. When the fractional CO2 laser vaporizes tiny columns of the vaginal mucosa, it forcibly triggers the body's wound healing cascade.
It's like a controlled trauma that wakes the body up and demands heavy physiological resources be sent to the area immediately.
Exactly. And the first major biological response is neocollagenesis. That's the synthesis of fresh, tightly woven collagen fibers that restore elasticity.
And the second response?
Angiogenesis, the rapid formation of new capillary blood vessels, which massively increases blood flow, oxygenation, and nutrient delivery to the vaginal walls.
Wow.
Yeah, as this cascade progresses, the superficial layer of the tissue, the squamous epithelium, grows back thicker, healthier, and vastly more robust. And crucially, this newly regenerated epithelium is absolutely loaded with glycogen.
Which brings us right back to the microscopic metropolis. That glycogen is the exact food source that the lactobacilli strains require to survive.
You've got it. By using biophysics to physically remodel the vaginal wall, the laser basically lays out a massive metabolic buffet for the good bacteria.
So the antibiotics clear out the pathogenic overgrowth, and then the laser ensures that the biological real estate is highly habitable for the lactobacilli.
Right. They feast on the newly available glycogen, rapidly multiply, and resume their heavy production of lactic acid.
And the clinical data tracked this exact chemical shift, didn't it? One of the trials noted a literal drop in the vaginal pH from a pretreatment average of 5.82, which is dangerously alkaline and classic territory for bacterial overgrowth, down to a healthy, highly acidic 5.61 following the laser therapy.
Yes. The researchers mapped a direct positive correlation. As the physical thickness and elasticity of the tissue improved, which they measured by the Vaginal Health Index, the lactobacilli colonization improved right alongside it.
So the structural integrity of the human tissue directly dictates the health of the bacterial microbiome.
Absolutely.
For you listening, if you are someone dealing with recurrent BV, intractable thrush, or the genitourinary syndrome of menopause where a drop in estrogen has wrecked your microbiome, this is a massive paradigm shift.
It's huge.
It proves that carpet bombing your system with antibiotics over and over again is only fighting half the battle. If the underlying physical tissue remains thin, dry, and devoid of glycogen, the good bacteria simply cannot move back in and defend the territory.
Treating the physical environment with a biophysical tool like a laser appears to be the secret to long-term systemic stability. It permanently moves the goalpost from simply eradicating pathogens to actively engineering microbiome restoration.
You are rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the nightclub so the bouncers have the resources to thrive and actually do their jobs.
Exactly.
It sounds like the ultimate medical breakthrough. However, if we pivot to the regulatory documents in our source stack, there is a giant flashing warning sign from the federal government that we absolutely have to address.
We definitely do. We have to view this impartially to ensure the full clinical picture is clear for everyone listening.
Right. So in 2018, the FDA issued a severe, highly publicized safety communication. They were explicitly warning the public and healthcare providers against using energy-based devices, both lasers and radiofrequency, for what they broadly categorized as vaginal rejuvenation or cosmetic vaginal procedures.
And the FDA did not mince words here. They explicitly stated that they have never cleared these specific devices for treating menopause symptoms, urinary incontinence, or sexual function.
Furthermore, they cited a disturbing rise in severe adverse events linked to these treatments. We are looking at reports of deep vaginal burns, severe internal scarring, and a condition called dyspareunia,
Which is chronic, severe pain during sexual intercourse.
It creates a stark, almost jarring dichotomy in our source material. On one hand, we have peer-reviewed clinical trials demonstrating dramatic reductions in pain, restored tissue elasticity, and thriving microbiomes.
And on the other hand, we have a federal agency warning about permanent scarring and debilitating burns.
It honestly reads as if we are analyzing two completely different medical technologies. How do we reconcile the incredible cellular healing with the FDA's horrifying adverse event reports?
The reconciliation really lies in the biophysics of how the thermal energy is applied, and crucially, whose hands are operating the device.
The practitioner matters.
Immensely. The danger largely stems from the aggressive commercialization of the treatment. The FDA specifically targeted the term vaginal rejuvenation because it is a meaningless, ill-defined marketing buzzword. It's not a medical diagnosis.
Right. The sources show clinics advertising terms like vaginal facelifts or designer vaginas, which is completely divorced from actual gynecological care.
That is exactly where the risk profile explodes. The FDA is primarily targeting non-medical aesthetic providers, think cosmetic spas and undertrained technicians who exploit regulatory loopholes.
They purchase these highly powerful ablative medical lasers and perform thermal procedures without any underlying medical necessity.
Right, often firing the laser onto perfectly healthy, heavily innervated tissue simply to achieve, like, cosmetic tightening.
And when an untrained tech uses the wrong thermal settings on healthy tissue, the biophysics work against the patient.
Totally. Instead of stimulating controlled neocollagenesis, the aggressive heat causes unregulated thermal damage,
Leading to heavy fibrosis, which is the severe scarring and nerve damage which causes the chronic pain the FDA highlighted.
Compare that to a board-certified gynecological clinician treating a specific diagnosed medical condition, like postmenopausal vaginal atrophy.
In that scenario, the tissue is genuinely compromised, thin, and lacking glycogen.
Exactly. The clinician uses precise, carefully calibrated settings designed to stimulate healing rather than obliterate tissue. The clinical trials show that in a highly controlled medical setting, the risk of those severe adverse events drops dramatically.
So the FDA's mandate is basically to protect the public from the unregulated wild west of cosmetic applications, where the severe risks completely eclipse the non-existent medical benefits.
That's it, exactly.
So the takeaway from the regulatory side is that the fractional laser itself isn't inherently dangerous, but the application matters immensely. It is the vast canyon between targeted medical application by a specialist versus cosmetic exploitation at a med spa.
The context of the treatment dictates the biological outcome.
Okay, looking at everything we've unpacked today, let's synthesize a definitive answer to the mission we started with. No, vaginal laser and radiofrequency treatments do not inherently trigger or cause thrush or BV. The risk of introducing a new pathogen through the procedure itself is incredibly rare.
Very rare.
However, the absolute clinical rule is that these devices must never be used during an active infection because you cannot apply thermal trauma to tissue that is already inflamed and battling an overgrowth.
Right. You'll just make it worse.
But when applied correctly by a trained medical professional treating a diagnosed condition, the biophysics of the laser actually remodel the vaginal tissue in a way that generates glycogen, feeds the lactobacilli, and helps prevent those recurrent infections from ever coming back.
It is a beautiful intersection of biophysics supporting microbiology. But, navigating these sources actually illuminated a completely different cutting-edge frontier for treating these conditions that goes beyond just tissue remodeling.
Oh, the VMT research.
Yes, VMT stands for vaginal microbiome transplants.
This is so fascinating.
We've spent this entire time talking about using lasers to rebuild the physical house so the native bacteria can recover. But a landmark 2019 study by Lev Sagi and colleagues explored a much more direct biological intervention.
What did they do?
The researchers took vaginal fluid from a healthy donor, someone with a perfectly balanced lactobacillus-dominant microbiome, and carefully transplanted it into 5 women suffering from intractable, completely uncurable BV.
They bypassed the antibiotics entirely and just introduced a fully formed, healthy ecosystem.
And the clinical outcomes were astounding. 4 out of the 5 women achieved long-term complete resolution of their BV.
Wow.
Their native dysfunctional microbiomes were essentially overwritten and permanently stabilized by the healthy donor fluid.
It forces us to look at the future of gynecological care holistically.
It really does. If fractional laser therapy is the ultimate biophysical tool for preparing the soil, plumping the tissue, driving angiogenesis, and creating the glycogen.
And VMT is the ultimate biological tool for planting the perfect seeds.
Exactly. Combining a physical laser protocol with a bacterial transplant could very well become the ultimate permanent cure for vaginal dysbiosis in the near future. We are moving away from merely killing pathogens and moving toward orchestrating entirely healthy ecosystems.
That is just mind-blowing. The next time you think about your body healing, don't just picture the visible architecture. Remember the microscopic metropolis. Sometimes, to finally stop the troublemakers, you have to do more than fight the infection. You have to completely rebuild the environment. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.